Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Coffee Chat with CastleHill. Today, I'm joined by Tom Birmingham and Ashish Shrowty. Tom, you want to maybe provide us a quick introduction of yourself, a little bit of your background?
Sure. Good morning, Tim. Hi, Ashish. Hi, everybody. My name is Tom Birmingham, and I've been a GRC professional for about 30 years now, mostly in the energy space. And most recently was a corporate vice president of corporate compliance at Emera, which is a utility holding company in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Thanks, Tim.
Ashish, would you be kind enough to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Hi, Tom. Happy New Year, everyone. So currently, I am the co-founder of a data privacy and security company called Divebell, and been in data and analytics for a long, long time. I don't even know, 20, 25 plus years. Vertically speaking, I have been oriented more towards financial services, have held leadership positions in technology and data departments at large Fortune 100 companies. And then very recently, I was also got exposure to the healthcare domain, which is quite interesting. I was at a startup that was actually acquired by a private equity shop. So happy to be here and chat about this interesting topic.
Awesome. So the topic itself. So let's talk about that a little bit. Data management is a massively broad topic overall, and what we wanted to try to narrow it down a little bit is, given all of the mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures that have been happening and are going to continue to happen, according to most folks, over the next period of time. How does that impact? What are those impacts on risk data overall? What are those key success criteria for people when they're trying to bring that information together? And when you're looking to get a comprehensive view of the combined entities or the separated entities, customers, suppliers, products, geographies, all of those different areas. What are some of the excitements that have happened, as I like to say, and how do those things bring together these capabilities? So why don't we start just talking a little bit about the drivers of it, and maybe Tom, you can just in the energy industry, because we have a great sort of diversity of industry experience in the conversation today. So from an energy industry perspective, where there is a lot of merger and divestiture required, how do those drivers really impact when you're bringing together that risk data? What's the boardroom conversation that's happening there?
Maybe it would be helpful to try to define what I mean by risk data when I'm talking about this a little bit, but I'll label it as that governance, risk, and compliance related data, the kind of information you would see about on your risk register, your governance structure, your board reporting framework, the kinds of information that go up to the board related to risk, and of course the compliance world of requirements, policies and procedures, your standards of conduct, maybe your control environment, and historic performance within those. So with that in mind, the data management piece related to mergers and acquisitions, in my experience, I've been through several now mergers, not so many divestitures, but on the merger side. And what I found, the availability of the information itself is hard to come by, certainly at a corporate level. In the energy space, there are different pockets of regulatory rules that have been around for a while, are pretty heavily enforced, and that's where you see some of the best risk-related data. Example would be on the reliability side. There's a lot of reliability requirements, safety requirements that there's a lot of data available for that. When I started digging into the availability of the supplier-related information, that became more manual. Copies of contracts, service level agreements that might exist. It was not necessarily in any organized database that we could go searching for. So I guess, Tim, in summary of sort of the availability of GRC related data, it's a mixed bag in my experience, with some being in spreadsheets, some being manually available, and more so recently, some being available in relational databases. But I'll let Ashish go, and we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, no, that completely resonates, right? Availability of data is just that is a topic of conversation itself. Um, given, I mean, there are so many different situations and scenarios where be it a divestiture or an acquisition. Today, the reality is that data is spread all across the place, right? And even in a smaller company, a mid-sized company, the companies come together probably through acquisitions itself, or they've acquired systems or technologies and they've never really bothered to actually bring information together. So, God forbid, one, in your environment, the data is spread in 5 different places. And now you're being looked at as an acquisition. And it becomes even more challenging because now in a short time frame and short period of time, you have to figure out what data do we have, where, not all data is equal. That's another topic, because there is internal data, there is external data, there's party data, all these things. So yeah, absolutely. I would say the bottom line there is, knowing where your data is. It's so important to do that regardless of the M&A situation, and especially that high value data. And maybe we can get into that if that's a topic of conversation.
That's a good segue, Ashish, right? Because it's the value, right? A lot of times in the data management space, the merger or acquisition reasoning, right? Why are we actually doing it? What is the purpose of it? Are we trying to build a more synergistic company? Are we growth? Are we geography, new products, whatever those things are, right? That doesn't always layer itself into the due diligence that went into where the data is. Is data important in that perspective? And so, you mentioned the example where there was an acquisition and divestiture. I imagine that created quite a few challenges from that perspective as well.
Yeah, and if this is a situation where, I was part of a back office company that was acquired by a bank, and we really the integration there was, again, I'm trying to summarize this. Was more around the sort of the internal systems, like, not so much the customer facing systems, because there wasn't a lot of overlap between what we were doing. We were servicing mutual fund complexes on Wall Street, whereas this was a bank that had acquired us. And not going to get into why this acquisition took place, but essentially that was the situation. So the extent of integration was really, our building security systems or your HR systems or your finance systems, but not so much the sub accounting and transfer agents, which was like core customer facing systems. They were left on their own. And it was very late into the whole acquisition activity that we realized, oh, we need to really not focus about, because we were all sort of nervous about, because this is such a complicated system doing transfer agency and sub accounting for our mutual fund customers, that we really don't need to focus on that, because that's not so much the focus of this conversation when it comes to this bank, because they're really more interested in these other systems. So let's leave these hierarchies in place, and where required, if there are some overlaps, just focus on those. So the whole focus was more on the internal facing systems, whereas we again got acquired, from this bank, to this big Wall Street Bank of New York essentially acquired us, which was really, again, a back office processor and a lot of, their big custodian. And in that case, this 20 minutes is not sufficient to go through all the, it's a long conversation, but suffice it to say, I'll go back to the point that I was making earlier, is that you got to know what your focus areas are. You got to know, as you said, Tim, absolutely, why is that acquisition happening? What is the acquirer intending to do? What is the business purpose of that acquisition? And that, if you really deep dive into it, you work backwards, and then you realize, oh, these are the data hierarchies, or these are the systems really that are either going to be retired, or we are going to become primary and going to have to take information into us. And by the way, we don't have unlimited amount of time. There's only 6 months to get this right. And then, of course, that gets into risk and all that, managing the risk of that transition.
Tom, in the energy industry, it's a different space from financial services, where a lot of times those mergers are, customer acquisition or product or geography driven. I know a lot of that's going to happen in the energy side as well. But from a compliance perspective, you also now are facing different rules and regulations in any kind of a merger in many cases. How does that impact that data acquisition piece of it?
It depends on your perspective. In the energy space, particularly on the utility side, for those that aren't familiar, we have franchise service territories. So the geographic service area that a utility will serve is generally protected based on regulatory construct. The regulators themselves establish the service territory. So the competition issue is not as severe as it would be on the financial, industry across geographic jurisdictions. The As a result of that, the rules, the requirements, the GRC related information that would be captured through an acquisition of, let's just call it utility holding company A, buys local or regional utility operating company B. The holding company wants to see, from a overall perspective, the risk associated with that jurisdiction and history of compliance and, regulatory caveats that are in that jurisdiction, which drive cost structure and programming and all that stuff. So from a corporate perspective, what I would be interested in is that kind of information, number of requirements, number of controls, history of compliance, and how are you managing that information within that jurisdiction. If you're staying in that jurisdiction, what you're not as interested, and maybe this is kind of one of the points Ashish was making, is depending on your role, you just continue to operate as you always have. You've got your local requirements. They're not really changing that much. And maybe one thing that would be different is trying to plug how do I consolidate this information for reporting purposes up to the holding company where I haven't had to do that in the past, or you've got a new entity there. One thing that I think I maybe, and you tell me, Tim, if this is worthwhile for your audience, is the stages of the merger and the acquisition, and how does that affect the due diligence, the integration, and the sort of management of information, from a GRC information perspective. Would that be helpful to touch on that?
I was actually going to go there next in the topics, because a lot of these integrations end up, especially in the initial activities, end up being turf wars from a data management perspective, and then that gets in the way of either the strategic goal or the ability to actually operate as a business. So yeah, let's go there.
And Ashish, if you don't mind, I'll just kind of set the table a little bit.
Absolutely.
So this will be an anecdotal experience. When I was working for a corporate holding company that purchased a large regional utility operating company, they had their own holding company structure. What was interesting from a GRC perspective in the due diligence phase was, okay, what's the culture? How are we going to sort of blend these two companies? The expectation was that two companies are going to come together. What does that mean from a cultural perspective? So I got assigned to the standards of conduct and trying to compare and contrast the two holding company standards of conduct. And that ended up, in addition to a few accounting requirements, being the one main policy that the two companies came together to harmonize prior to day one. And that was an interesting exercise that brought a lot of different people together over a fairly short amount of time. We managed to get this done in about 8 to 12 weeks. And it was an opportunity for a lot of people to start getting to work together on something tangible outside the financials. And that, I think, was a good pre-merger, pre-day one exercise. What was interesting post-merger, post-day one, was, okay, now that we have our kind of cultural mandate through the standards of conduct established, how do we now begin to start sharing this GRC-related information? And as we've talked about, it really depended on how readily available the information was in hard copy versus electronic copy. And in the electronic version of this information, what was it? Was it structured data or unstructured data? And what we ended up doing, sort of following up on that code of conduct, was creating basically a master spreadsheet of all the requirements that were readily available across all the different operating jurisdictions. And that gave us a pretty good sense of the regulatory requirements for each of these operating jurisdictions. What that in turn helped us do on the integration piece was understand the staffing requirements, the HR requirements, the people, the process, and the technology. So we had a pretty good working view of like who's doing what from a governance perspective, what are the policies, procedures, the requirements, and the controls around those regulatory requirements, and then where are the technology platforms and where does the data sit on those platforms. That in turn really helped on the post-merger integration, which was to identify where the gaps are and try, help us really provide a business case for an enterprise database management software platform that would help standardize the taxonomy, the flow, the reporting, the metrics, the targets, all of that stuff that eventually got brought up into the board reports. So hopefully that helps frame it.
So in effect, you're looking at, you're getting rid of a lot of the emotion involved in the merger and acquisition by working through something which is hard, but has a finite boundary, right? And actually trying to get those policies matched together, and then that can drive you to other realization of where critical control data was going to be coming from in a lot of cases, right? So get away from the turf wars.
Yeah, good summary.
I think Ashish, at Divebell, it's one of the control. In effect, you're being a proactive control in a similar way of not, getting past the turf war to say, well, this is where the data is. We're not asking you about it, not accusing you of something, but is that fair too?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this also goes back to the availability point that Tom was mentioning right up front, which is to know where that important data is. And in a large organization, sometimes it's more often than not, we find that you think you know where your data is, but you don't. And doing this in a manual fashion and in any organization that is of any size is we absolutely don't recommend it, because every single time we have deployed where there has been some skepticism on, hey, we got a not good, we got a good IT department, we got our catalogs, we got our metadata in place, where we know where our information is and what types. And we basically say, okay, well, there'd be a good reconciliation exercise. If what you find deploying Divebell is what you really have, great, you're in a good place. And I'll tell you, I can't think of one instance in the last 8 that we have deployed where they didn't think that, oh, wow, I kind of knew that my customer information was in these 3 different places, but I had no idea that there were copies lying around in my data lake or in this other place. And who has ownership, right? So when you talk about governance, you also talk about accountability. And the next question, immediately the sponsor went, in this case it was a security officer, went, who's the owner of this? And who put that data there, and how old is it? And who do I who do I contact to get this thing cleaned up? And even trying to find who the owner of that information is when it comes to data, it's complex and sometimes very challenging. So yes, to a long-winded answer to your question, Tim, is yes.
And that's, I like the conversation because we're going end to end from the policy statement, right? What is it that we're trying to achieve, and what's the compliance and requirement side of it, to the data being such a critical asset for an organization, you're creating risk by having data to begin with, right? By being in business. And so how do you then ensure that you're complying with what the goals and targets are from a regulatory, just a business perspective, or any of those pieces? um, and you both have mentioned this a little bit, so we don't necessarily have to go too far into it. But what's you know, how do we make that decision not to integrate something? Right? What is the key aspect of saying, what, we're not going to integrate this set of information because it's not going to provide us with a better mitigation of risk, or the controls that we can put in place around this combined information aren't sufficient, to merit bringing it together, or some of those types of things. Any insight into that?
I'll get to your question, Tim, by setting a little sort of story here. What was interesting in one of the experiences in doing an integration strategy was whether or not we would take on a sort of what I'll call an integration related project. In addition to all of the financials and the operations, there was this question of whether we would put in place a you could call it a governance, risk, and compliance strategy that would go across all of the operating entities. And we decided to move ahead with that project because we knew that at the board level, we needed to integrate the kind of compliance and risk status of each of the operating entities. So we developed what I'll call a corporate enterprise view, standards and policies of what we expected each of the operating companies to do. So we standardized the definitions of what a compliance program and a risk management program look like. And then we asked each of these operating entities to go into their organizations and develop their programming around this standardized structure that would lead to a more efficient standardized reporting structure. As part of that exercise, to Ashish's point a few minutes ago, that the standardization, like, okay, here's your standard operating map, your roadmap. Go turn inward and look at yourself with these questions in mind and see what you find. And what was interesting, one of the outcomes is, as Ashish alluded to, was we had no idea, these operating entities just hadn't looked at themselves through those questions before. And it was very illuminating for them to say, oh, wow, I think we could do things better ourselves if we organized ourselves a little differently. So what that was successful in standardizing some of the things that we did know we wanted up at the board reporting level. But to your question about what not to integrate, we also identified that there's at some point you get into so much detail and so much information from a corporate perspective. It's not necessary. We don't need that much information. So we decided at that time, it's just, let's take a look at what's in effect. I use that term, like, do you have these operating procedures in place versus are they effective? We didn't go into the control testing, deep dive inside of each of these operating entities to look and see how well they're functioning. And there was a couple reasons why we didn't do that deep dive, but I think there was some relief felt by the operating entities. You don't need that information. This is our job. They like, we've got it. I know you bought us, but you have to trust us. Let us do our job. And it was like, okay, that's good. We want to trust you, but we also need some level of verification. So here we kind of created that dividing line for what we needed up at the top from a corporate reporting perspective, and what below that line let the operating companies, manage their business.
Yeah. We bump into similar situations all the time with customers when we're potentially migrating between different systems or different standards or frameworks even. And how do you take something which is based on a particular set of standards in the past, and then is it really worth translating all of that information into the current standard, right, where the current standard has evolved significantly in a space, and in most cases it's not worthwhile doing those things, right? What's worthwhile is capturing the critical data elements that are needed to actually drive, as you talked about, Tom, some of those reports drive some of that information together. So
Yeah, and Tim, I think one of the key things, and I won't go into too many details because it's a very complicated topic, is from a technology standpoint, you can always build what are called bridge tables or mapping tables, right? This maps to this, and this is the way you map it. Simple, right? That's not the challenge. Of course, it does to a certain degree it is, but the challenge really is if you are translating, are you translating accurately? Who understands? Who's taking on the risk if what you think you're translating to is actually inaccurate? So the understanding of the translation is where the risk is, not so much the technical implementation of it. And we ran into this situation when we were trying to consolidate numbers when we got acquired, and the way we were aggregating was very different from the acquiring company, and we both had the same customers, so we had different business relationship with the same customers. So how do you overall report on that account? And there were interpretations on the acquiring side and the interpretations on the acquiree side, and they never matched. So we decided to keep those things separate and let the business actually develop an interpretation, so there would be two different numbers reported. And we in technology decided not to take on that risk of reporting quote unquote wrong numbers because it could be interpreted very differently. So you have to be really careful about, you can go gangbusters with just these bridge tables and mapping tables, and you can try to combine things, but I would say be aware of what the implication of translation.
I think that's a key part of, we call it the business hub at CastleHill, with the concept of understanding what your company is actually, what the facts of a company are actually about. That's really hard in a merger, right? Because two different perspectives of what the facts are overall. Accounting is not a science; it's an art. At the end of the day,
Yeah.
all those good things. So when we talk about those types of taxonomies, I mean, have you seen a company that really had a strong taxonomy and was able to use it as part of that merger to make things run more successfully? Or is that always left on the sidelines and not really brought to the fore?
My experience has been, this whole field of master data management, so again, from a technology standpoint, it translates into this technology called master data management. And there's different terminologies for it: customer data management, 360, what have you, right? um, it's never easy. I haven't come across a situation where we could easily combine the two together. I would say that if you align to standards, and there are many different standards out there, I mean, you can Google for it, you can find out. You definitely have a leg up instead of having some proprietary way of organizing your data. So if you are able to at least map to a standard, it doesn't have to be the latest and the greatest standard, but if you can map to a standard, you have a leg up in those conversations where, hey, what do you got? What are your controls? How do you standardize information, right? Like if you say, well, this is a proprietary database and we built this up and we are really proud of it, blah blah blah, that's not going to carry a lot of weight. If you are able to say, this is our information, it maps to this and this standard, and we have taken, we have interfaces that you can extract this information out in this particular standard. That definitely carries a lot of weight, and I can remember in a couple of situations. This was more in the healthcare space, not in the financial services space, where we had, so in healthcare, there are ICD-9, ICD-10 codes, and 9 is the previous version, 10 is the latest. I guess there's 11 now, but we at least had some mapping to these ICD codes, and that made it really, really easy. So we were being acquired by private equity companies, so they could understand really what we meant when we said we mapped to an ICD-10 taxonomy. So, but yeah, I mean, that's what I would say there. I don't know, Tom, if you have any comments.
Yeah, just a little different perspective. What I think is interesting is this idea of taxonomies that are developed externally by standard setting agencies versus those taxonomies that are developed internally based on your business, nature of the work you do, who you work for, how they think. From an external standards developing kind of around taxonomies, I think there's a really interesting development happening in the ESG space, the environment, social, and governance space. And Ashish, I think you touched on it. There's very well established accounting standards that you understand pretty much. A corporate report, a financial report, and the information that's contained in that report means something similar to what three different companies, if you were to stack them up all next to each other, those financial reports, there's a common taxonomy around accounting standards that give that financial information meaning across multiple companies, multiple people. What's really interesting, I think, is the development of this non-financial materiality standards around ESG. And how are the standard setting bodies developing a taxonomy that allows investors to look at non-financial information in a very similar way that they look at financial information. And as you guys probably know, there's a ton of work going on internationally around what these non-financial accounting standard equivalents should look like. I think we've seen the European Union develop an interesting set of taxonomy to define how to quantify materiality around these various ESG measurements. But I guess, Tim, kind of bringing it back to your core question about taxonomy, it's really interesting to see it develop in real time across the world around ESG standards.
And we're not having the regulators, which is sort of a common, I think, in all industries. There's sort of always been a common aspect of saying, well, the regulatory bodies or the oversight bodies should be determining what that taxonomy is, whereas they come back and say, no, that's not our job. We don't know your business.
Yeah.
And ESG providing that as a more independent across those organizations and getting those pieces is definitely, it's a lot of fun. So I know we're just about out of time. Any last items that you'd like to leave us with, Tom?
We didn't talk much about divestiture. I honestly don't have a ton of experience around that, but I think it's interesting, and I'd be interested to hear Ashish's perspective in terms of modularizing your data sets and how, not so much the systems themselves, but how the data sits on those systems and making a divestiture more practical and feasible. I think could be facilitated by how your data is structured within your given databases and your data lake and your platforms. Ashish, do you have any thoughts on sort of how data can be structured, not just to grow, but to, spin off and divest?
Yeah, I think honestly, Tom, it boils down to having good data modeling and data architecture practices. If you normalize your data appropriately, the whole field of normalization is really about reuse and not having duplications, right? And so there are techniques and disciplines in data design and data architecture that if followed appropriately would let you. Another way to say it is that it is modularized, that your master information is really in one place. Your reference the information that hangs off this information really in one place, and then you have appropriate constraints and integrity sort of conditions where you don't duplicate information. If you change something here, then you absolutely need to change things here as well, and so that thing data stays, if there are references to that data, that it stays in sync, and so on and so forth. So I would say the bottom line for me is you have to have good discipline, design, And in this new world of data lakes, again, a separate topic we probably don't have time for, a lot of these rules are being violated left and right. It's unbelievable. And at the end of the day, if one of these companies is going to get acquired, I mean, good luck, honestly. It's going to be really, really, really tough, the kinds of things that are happening right now with so-called democratization of data. But hopefully that answers some of what you are asking, Tom. But it's a big topic.
We used to refer to it as the information supply chain, and you guys both alluded to this in the different industries of the fact that if you don't know who your suppliers are, it's really hard to be able to do that plug and play kind of information where you can either switch your data source or potentially lose that data source without the whole rest of the house of cards come tumbling down. And yeah, see that way too much in poorly designed data lakes these days. So I want to thank you both for joining me. I really appreciate the time, and thank you all. And if you'd like to see this or other podcasts, please go to the CastleHillRisk.com website. We have all of the podcasts available there, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Ashish.